Hi, I'm Sarah Skwire, and I am a senior fellow at Liberty Fund. I work primarily with the Online Library of Liberty, which is sponsoring today's video chat. I am here today with Jacob Levy, who is the Tomlinson Professor of Political Theory at McGill, and with Aeon Skoble, who's Bartlett Chair in Free Speech and Expression and Professor of Philosophy at Bridgewater State University. I'm delighted to be here with Jacob and Aeon, who have both been dear friends of mine for longer than I can count now. And it is a real pleasure to be with them today. Today, we're going to talk about Billy Christmas's new book, which is called Property and Justice. It is a thin little book, but it is deceptive. I found this very rough sledding as a read. It is fairly heavy duty philosophical and political theory, straight theory, and not necessarily a book that one might grab off of the shelf just for pleasure reading or general intellectual inquiry. That said, I think it has a lot of incredibly important meat at the center of the text, and some really key takeaways for people who are interested in questions of rights and of justice and of liberty. And so maybe Aeon and Jacob, we want to start there by thinking about what are kind of the key takeaways from the text, the key pieces that make the text interesting and powerful.
And you want to start? You're a little bit closer to this literature than I am.
Well, I mean, it's probably not a secret that natural rights as a concept often gets a bad rap. And so one of the nice takeaways from this book at a super general level is that it provides an intelligible way to talk about a natural rights theory that doesn't easily fall prey to the sort of caricature criticisms that are often filed against natural rights arguments.
So what's that character look like?
Oh, well, I had a professor in grad school who anytime a Hegelian would bring up the Geist, he would sort of look around confusedly and say, Geist, what Geist? I don't see any Geist. And like that was the extent of his refutation of German idealism. But a lot of times when people don't like natural rights theory, they'll say something like that at that level of sophistication. Like, well, you know, I can see your spleen, but where are the rights? I don't see any rights. So how could they be natural?
Brooding omnipresence in the sky was
and if it's not that kind of a caricature, then it's the other kind of caricature, which is, well, that's based on theological premises, and I'm going to reject that as an argument. So therefore, so either it's completely like my old professor's approach to the Geist, or it's assumed that for a natural rights theory to exist, it would have to be theological, and so that's a non-starter. And of course, many natural rights theorists do have some theological background, but it's not necessary for the argument. And there's plenty of examples of attempts to do natural rights that don't involve theological premises, and Christmas's book is one of them. So it proceeds in a non-theological, straight up philosophical derivation of what it would mean to talk about rights. And the point of the word natural there is simply not part of the pre-existing political system.
Okay. And what else do we get? I mean, does he just sort of solve the natural rights argument that Aeon has been defending at cocktail hours since the beginning of his career, or do we get some more stuff?
We get a three-way relationship among the ideas of justice, rights, and property, and those are deeply connected in the intellectual tradition of rights-based thinking and ideas about justice as such. I mean, in most non-English languages, what it is the word for something like justice and the word for something like rights are very clearly related. In Romance languages, they're both derivatives of the same Latin word jus that we still get for justice and jurisdiction and judge and all those things. And justice in that philosophical tradition, unlike in kind of contemporary political discourse where it becomes a name for every good thing one could politically want, justice is a very juridical, legalistic virtue. It's the name for, depending on how you look at it, a kind of morality that is shaped like law, that really ought to have right determinate answers in all the cases, in ways that are going to provide dispute settlement and dispute resolution in the case of conflict. So it's either a legalistic system of morality or a moralized, idealized system of law. And in the latter sense, justice becomes another way of saying something like what we call natural law in the intellectual tradition, of which natural rights is an offshoot. Those old connections have often been lost sight of in the post-1971 political philosophy literature and in ordinary political conversation. They are also both traditionally very tied up with property. What a legal system does, almost first and foremost after regulating acts of interpersonal violence, is to allocate or regulate or delimit or specify holdings in the external world. All of this is historically true. It's etymologically true. It's become philosophically harder and harder to get at, except for two branches of contemporary political philosophy. That is to say, libertarianism and a certain set of things that are stylized as left libertarianism, though they're not the whole of those things. Arising out of Robert Nozick's reconstruction of John Locke, these are literatures that say people have rights, and their rights are quintessentially like property rights and encompass property rights. And a theory of justice will then be a theory of those rights fitting together. This has become a long set of those two literatures, sometimes talking internally to themselves, sometimes talking to each other, but no one else, about how it is one should think about these ostensibly Lockean ideas that one of the key fundamental natural rights is the right to appropriate the external world and turn it into a natural pre-political property right. This book is an intervention in, but to my eye, in a lot of ways, a major solution to lots of the debates within those literatures that has this, has the additional effect, and now we're getting to what Sarah really cares about, which is why it is that people who aren't specifically deep in these literatures would care. That has the effect of reshuffling how, in general, we would want to normatively think about rights and property. A lot of the people watching this will be people coming out of one or another branch of the libertarian tradition, in which that Locke to Nozick story plays a very substantial role. And Christmas offers a serious, sophisticated justification of a theory of rights that is deeply enmeshed in property, but that breaks in very important ways with the Locke-Nozick tradition and also with the left libertarian alternative to it that I mentioned, in ways that I think are actually very promising and are very promising for how to think about theories of rights and theories of property as matters of justice more ordinarily understood. I'll go ahead and spoil one of the things that I think that that's truest for. And that's that the, at least many ways of thinking about the Locke-Nozick natural rights theory have really idealized exclusive, freehold or fee simple, put up a fence around a piece of land kind of ownership. And Christmas is very concerned to restore the ability to think in terms of rights and justice for relationships to property that are not individual, fee simple, or freehold.
Yes, I don't think I've ever seen the word usufruct used that often since the last time I was like digging around in 17th century sort of religious texts, where usufruct is a word that pops up all of the time. And I was kind of delighted to see it. This means for people who haven't spent a lot of time digging around in 17th century religious text, usufruct is the right to use the produce of a thing on the land. So you may not own, you don't own the orchard, but you have a right to a certain percentage of the fruit that is produced by the orchard is a good way
or a right to use in some other way. So a right to pass over is a kind of usufruct right. It is not traditionally legalistically a property right. And Christmas wants to weaken that distinction and to talk about property rights not as being ways of moralizing objects in the world, but as being ways of thinking about the expression of a right to liberty, a right to act in the world, which includes the right to act on the world and using the world. And this shift in thinking about property rights from the external objects to the actions of an actor, the plans and activities that people are trying to pursue, means that there's going to be a whole lot of things that people can be trying to do with objects in the world, many of which do not demand the radical exclusivity or individual ownership of the fee simple and freehold model, which allows, among other virtues, for serious incorporation of the work on the commons and common pool resources associated with the Bloomington School and Eleanor and Vincent Ostrom, which I think is something to which a lot of people in various libertarian traditions pay a kind of lip service, but don't really think about how to incorporate into a model of thinking about property that at the end of the day still really does idealize fee simple with a fence around it and just one owner.
Yeah, I think one reason, just to build on that, I think one reason why he is concerned to do that is because the way he wants to explain what rights are forces him to address the possibility of conflicting rights, because his theory of rights is one in which they don't conflict, the compossibility criterion, which he's written about before. And so I really liked the essay that he'd written a couple of years ago about compossibility. And so I was really pleased going through here to see that he not only reiterates that distinction, but expands on it further. And I think that goes to why he wants to talk about property in the way you just described, that it helps eliminate potential, ostensible rights conflicts, I think are made to go away by the way that he's explaining all these things.
But compossibility as a criterion has
which we're going to define right now, right?
Yes.
Somebody's going to.
Compossibility means joint simultaneous possibility.
Not conflicting.
Compossible moral claims will, when they're rightly specified, have no conflicts. It will be the case that each claim can be satisfied simultaneously. It's kind of a technical word in legal and political philosophy for the expression of something that in law is a commonplace. Compossibility has as one possible expression in thinking about property, and Christmas talks about this, the map of fenced off freehold property. So everybody has their 16-acre plot of land, and you can draw a map that says, here's where each plot starts and each plot ends. And within each plot of land, the rights are complete and total. And then the rights sharply cut off at the fence, and there are complete and total rights in the next owner over. Christmas wants to have us take seriously the importance of compossibility. It has to be the case that all of our real rights can be respected simultaneously. But to recognize a couple things about the fenced off model. One thing about the fenced off model is that it requires either ignoring or inflating little intrusions, nuisances. Does my complete and total right over my plot of land include the ability to build a skyscraper up to the sky that completely blocks the sunlight onto your land? Either we're going to say, yes, I get to do whatever I want on my land, And so the effect of my depriving you of sunlight is going to be morally ignored. Or we take it seriously, and in taking it seriously, we have to say, well, I have a right to my access to the sun. Therefore, in a compossible world, you must not have the right to build a skyscraper. Now, law characteristically has ways of settling this under the doctrine of nuisances. There are some little things that we ignore, and there are some little things that we make some compensation for, and we still let them be little things. But if you're building it into the structure of your deep moral theory of rights, people tend not to be able to deal with that. They take it to go one of two directions. Christmas says that by concentrating on the activities that each person is pursuing, rather than the moralization of the object as such, we can say some people are doing stuff on their land that really is completely destroyed if access to the sun is cut off, and some people aren't. And some people, in order to do the thing they need to do on their land for their activity, really need to be able to affect a neighbor's access to sun, and some people don't.
So one of the important things we can get from the book then is some grounding on ways to live together better, to live together more justly, to live together more, I might even say more gently with each other, right? So that you have justice that doesn't have to come in the form of courts of justice, but comes instead in the form of treating each other justly. Does that seem?
Yes, and he wants to insist more freely.
Okay.
Because the acts of total exclusion, where I say, because this is my land, you can't do anything on it, when I'm not necessarily doing very much with it. Christmas wants to say, that is a genuine potential infringement on other people's freedom. And that we should take seriously the infringement on freedom that enclosure and walling off and claiming more rights over land than I actually need for my activities constitutes.
Mm-hmm.
And so he thinks that he's offering an account of property that is more compatible with freedom than the standard model.
Yeah, because he specifically says, I'm going to try to tie property rights to the idea of personal freedom, and he claims this hasn't plausibly been done yet, which I guess is empirical, but in any case, he does it, and the reason that he's doing it is because there's what you might suspect to be a problem when we've got the brute fact of diverse and potentially conflicting human purposes, right? And so he ties his theory about acting to activities that are connected to the nature of my person, and then the rights only protect activity that doesn't itself constitute the interference with other people's activities, and that's how he connects the dots there.
Right, and he actually says we only have one enforceable right. Right, this is on page 43. He says, not only are all persons endowed with an original right to non-interference with their ongoing non-interfering activities, right? So we're endowed with the right not to be messed with, as long as we're not messing with other people, but we're endowed with no other enforceable rights. That's it, as far as natural right goes for Christmas. That's that's an incredibly minimalist. It would be hard to be more minimalist, a statement of
indeed, but it's very economical, because other things that you might think are rights are either corollaries of that, or you're made a mistake.
While it's not the main point of the book, it is a refreshing change compared to the literatures that I spent a lot of time reading, to see a robust defense of non-interference as the basis of liberty rights. Over the last 25 years, that's been pushed to the edges in favor of the so-called civic republican idea of liberty as non-domination, with non-interference becoming more and more of a caricatured position off to the side. And Christmas has, I think, some very good responses to that. But it means that his version of non-interference is meaningfully different. And it is a more socially embedded kind of non-interference than we have sometimes found in in other people who would say that that right is the sole and exclusive and primitive original right.
Right, and I think this is sort of what I meant by saying it feels more sort of socially embedded. It feels gentler, feels more about how we do the things that we do together. It seems to me like Christmas's book, in a lot of ways, works very hard to find ways to talk about property and about non-interference from a libertarian perspective without ever falling prey to or opening itself up to that kind of caricatured image that people have of it's going to be all fences and borders patrolled by people with guns. You know, don't you dare set foot on my land because I've got a shotgun and you set foot on my land and I'm just going to blast your head off, right? And he's so careful not to open those doors. And whenever I thought I was going to catch him opening one of those doors, he was so thoughtful about that.
Yeah.
And he, I don't think that he's even thoughtful about it in a concessionary way. I think that he understands our relationships to the external world in a very Ostrom and James Scott kind of way that says the things that agriculturalists do with land simply are not and never were the whole of human relationships to the external world. One of the important questions about the Lochnostic tradition is whether it's the case that that tradition requires us to say, prior to European contact with the Americas were unowned. That is to say, the indigenous peoples who lived here had no juridical rights over their land. And there's good reason to think that Locke thought the answer was, yes, they were unowned. That's not uncontroversial. But either the Americas were unowned, in which case the agricultural settlers could come along and say, I've planted a farm, therefore I now own this land, therefore you have nothing. Or the land was owned, in which case there was no conceptual space for newcomers to show up and plant land. But neither of those things can be the right way to think about coexistence in a world where different people are doing different things with their resources. And Christmas takes seriously that agricultural isn't the whole story, and the kinds of cooperative and common relationships with the land that have characterized most of humanity for most of history and all of humanity for at least periods of time, grazing on the commons in England in the face of potential enclosures, that all of that's real too. And that we should not let our thinking about property and rights be driven by the particular case of the very space and time intensive relationship to land that is agriculture.
I was interested also in, he has a brief discussion, a couple of brief discussions maybe to point out. He does talk about kinds of property that are not land, right? And I forget where the discussion happened, but the image in my head was when he was talking about getting up when you're, say, watching a show or something like that. And if you get up to use the restroom, it's not okay for people to come to take your seat, right? They can't just do that, even though that's not, you haven't, it's not your property exactly, but it's not your property. I was thinking about that and how when we were kids, if you had to get up, there was a big sort of childhood ritual of save my seat for me, I'll be right back, right? But it doesn't
extend permanently into the future.
Correct.
This show, I have
yes.
something like a normative customary right to keep my seat.
Right, and if you grow up with siblings, right, of course, the legal system surrounding this stuff gets infinitely more complex among siblings. Like, does it last through the whole course of a commercial break? If you're not back when the commercials are, there used to be commercials. If you're not back before the commercials are over, do you lose your seat, right? If the dog takes your seat, does that count? It all gets very, very complicated. So that was a conversation and a point that I thought was interesting, and points to his interest throughout the book in property not just being this sort of fenced.
Yeah, he has a whole discussion of intellectual property,
yes,
which is definitionally not physical.
Yep, go I was going to
Well,
point us to that, but please unpack.
I'm largely agnostic about the IP debate, which infuriates people on both sides of the issue. But I thought that his discussion, it was one thing I'll say without offending either side, is that it's an example of the way that his conception of property having to do with people's activities extends into these non-physical realms. So I thought it was a very plausible case. If there were anything to help me push me to one side or the other, it would be the way he explains how this is an example of people's activities not being interfered with. I did find it more plausible than many of the other accounts of IP that I've been bombarded with.
And just to be explicit, his argument is that intellectual property is always unjustifiable.
Because of the activities.
Yes, because
Yeah.
it is because it is an infringement on the liberty of the next person who could come along and in a non-rivalrous way write the same novel or produce the same drug. Or
Right, because if I give you a copy of the book, I still have the book. So
Yes.
if I weren't allowed to do that, it would interfere with your activities, or you'd be interfering with my activities. Right.
I have to say that at the end, I remain mildly agnostic about IP, but it's one of the nice things about an argument like this is when all of the conceptual work turns out to have at least some clearly identifiable conclusions. And yep, he's right. It follows from his argument, it follows from his liberty-based argument.
Yes.
That the infringement on everybody else's liberty, that is intellectual property, saying, you may not write this book that I've written. You may not copy it down word for word and sell it again. That infringement on liberty is not justified. It's plainly not justified in terms of his theory. It's an implication, and it's an implication that genuinely follows and helps us think about the importance of the theory.
Right. And I think, all three of us make our living selling our intellectual property to other people. So we're always going to be really torn on this, right? You can give me a very good argument, but I'm still going to be real nervous about agreeing with it to the point of, losing my salary.
I'm more nervous about losing patents than I am about losing copyright.
Yeah.
And
Why?
copyright.
Because of the negative incentives that would engender?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. There's
a frequent argument that we need patents for intellectual property, because otherwise there won't be an incentive for people to make new inventions.
Right.
Yeah.
But I don't know if that's.
I like copyright, but I'm more nervous about the social consequences of abolishing patents than I am about the social consequences of abolishing copyright.
That makes sense.
What did you guys think of his fairly brief discussion of reparations? Did you catch that? I marked it. Hang on.
I don't think I took notes on that section, but I don't remember not liking it.
I just thought it was interesting because you don't see it. You don't see that discussed terribly often. It's one of those things. It calls it restitution. Sorry. This is at the bottom of 46.
And it's a source of possible positive duties.
Right. Restitution ought not to be regarded as undoing a rights violation. Rather, the rationale for restitution is that the interference is still ongoing until the victim has what they need to proceed in the activity that was interrupted. And he says restitution, and in my head, I thought reparations, right? And I don't know whether that's a false equation on my part, or if you think that it would apply to ideas of, say, reparations for slavery.
No, it doesn't directly apply.
Not without a bunch of missing steps, which I don't think he's committed to making.
Yeah.
So he's thinking about sort of immediate restitution for I
took
I
that
walk
section
into
to
Jacob's
refer to
office.
criminal punishments. Yeah.
I mean, it can be the case that even after restitution, there remains an outstanding debt. Reparations are longer in the future than restitution. The first duty is stop doing the bad thing you're doing and give back the thing that you've taken. To the degree that the duration of time that you're doing a bad thing or taking other people's stuff leaves some consequences that are bigger than just undoing it, or to the degree that I've taken something and destroyed it, so I can't give it back. Reparations is the long-term version of that. One thing, though, that reparations reminds me to say to, in particular, the Nozick fans who are watching, is Christmas is consistently very interested in saying Nozick gives us the qualifiers and exceptions and marginal cases to his theory of property without really ever giving us a theory of property. This is particularly about the so-called Lockean proviso that says, in order for it to be justifiable for me to appropriate the external world, I must leave as much and as good for everyone else. And the meaning of that Lockean proviso has been the stuff of this debate, but both within libertarianism and within left libertarianism since Nozick's time.
I think the three of us have kicked it around on Facebook more than once.
That's probably true. And Christmas perfectly rightly says, Nozick just kind of jumped ahead to this limitation on the acquisition of property without having given us a convincing account of the moral worth of acquiring property in the first place. He has a paragraph where he says, well, there's all the familiar stuff about why we want property. And Christmas says, surely we actually want to make more sense of our theory of property than that. And it turns out, and here's another interesting implication of the book, that on the fuller theory of the relationship of property to freedom that Christmas lays out, the Lockean proviso never has occasion to kick in. So he rejects that whole literature that is obsessed with figuring out the Lockean proviso, because the question of just original acquisition simply is very different from how it has looked all along in those concerns.
That's a valuable service he's committing right there.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I think that's really helpful for those of us who've never really been entirely on board with the Lockean proviso in the first place.
But to worry all the time about the exception to a rule that you haven't really spelled out in the first place, I found that a very convincing part of the argument. And do you also think that was a fair? And I think this is true for reparations too. You know, Nozick is interested in the funny cases off to the edges.
Yeah, but with something like reparations, Nozick just punts the ball on that one. He specifically says there might be some interesting problems here, but I'm not going to get into those right now. So, you know, it's fun to speculate about what a Nozickian approach to reparations might look like, but it's not going to be in the text because he specifically says he's not going to do it.
No, but he does speculate.
Yeah,
it might be.
This. Yeah.
It might be that if we take reparations seriously in light of the whole inherited history of injustice, that we end up back at John Rawls's theory of distributive justice and a theory of justice, which notionally this was a book all about, or not all about, but in part about responding to and refuting. So there is this funny way in which he ends that discussion by saying, it might be that this whole theory I've just laid out is moot because the exception of reparations might swallow the rule of property rights.
Right, but I do like the way Nozick deals with the Lockean proviso in a post-state of nature context, because every time I acquire something under current conditions, I've necessarily replaced it with enough and as good by trade. And I don't think Christmas would necessarily disagree with that, but as you say, because his conception of acquisition in the first place is different, his response to Nozick's handling of the proviso would be different as well.
One of the books that was in the back of my head off and on while I was reading this was lemaskey's what is it, a person's
rights in the
moral
community.
Right, where he talks about, and my favorite thing about that book is the idea of people as inherently pursuers of projects. The reason that we're people is because we like to do stuff. And it kind of doesn't matter what stuff it is that we like to do, if it's knitting or playing D&D or doing martial arts or playing hockey or going to rock concerts or what, it doesn't really matter. We have these projects that we like to do, and that makes us human. And one of the things I liked very much in the Christmas book is this sense of a richness of human activity. Right?
Yeah, I also thought of the Lemaskey's projects when I was looking at Christmas's activities.
So one nice thing and one worry about
Mhm.
this. A nice thing about it in the book is that Christmas does the work that is often not done to talk about the relationship between this kind of structured technical debate on rights and the political idea of liberalism. And he says that on his understanding, the theory of justice, the theory of rights that he's developing, which is the theory of justice, taking justice and its structure seriously, really is more or less necessarily a kind of liberal theory, and it uniquely lends support to liberalism, because what it is to have rights is in part to have the ability to make a range of different choices. And rights as a juridical category, as a legal category, don't depend on the particular choices that I'm making. So there's a kind of neutrality that's built in to rights and to liberalism.
Mhm.
The worry is that he doesn't revisit that idea late in the book after he's given us this robustly activity-based account of what rights we have over the external world. And I'm not entirely sure that he's not in the first part borrowing some of the ongoing halo of the fenced off model. Because my rights over the external world on his model are not, in a particular case, neutral with respect to the choices that I'm making and the activities that I pursue. I have a right to pursue the activities that I pursue, and that means that I gain a right to pursue those activities over objects in the world. But that means that the rights that I acquire or hold, I'm not sure which the right word is, genuinely do change depending on, say, what I'm doing with the land.
Mm.
And I worry that that introduces a non-neutrality into the juridical structure, into the structure of rights at the end. I found myself wondering whether there can ever be, on this account, anyone who acts securely so as to conserve a resource. If I want to establish a conservatory parkland, that's never going to look like an activity. It's going to look like I'm engrossing more of the natural world than my activities actually call for. Whereas on the freehold model, because I care about the long-term consequences and the long-term value of my good, it can sometimes be the case that I invest in, own, fence off, and then protect rather than using a chunk of the natural world.
But why couldn't we understand protecting as using?
He doesn't.
No, but why couldn't, but since this is bothering you, why don't you want to make that move?
Because it gets in the way very quickly of his desire to let our rights over the world intersperse, so that there's somebody who has a right to fish and somebody who has a right to swim and somebody who has a right to walk on the path next. He's envisioning a social world in which, so long as our activities don't really genuinely interfere with each other's activities, our rights over the land or the external world can just follow our activities.
I get that, but doesn't that just mean that you can't have too much of a nature preserve? But it wouldn't mean you couldn't have some kind of a nature preserve. Like you could say, well, I'm going to make all of Canada a nature preserve. Like that would fall afoul of his theory. But I don't see why you couldn't say, well, these 30 square miles, that's a nature preserve. I'm not sure why that would.
Along I come as a free actor and I say, my next property is to fish, or my next activity is to fish in that lake.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have the right to exclude me?
Well, if we've established that I have a property right in the lake.
But that's putting the cart before the horse. He thinks that the property rights that can justly be established are limited to those that are genuinely the expressions of the activity that the human is engaged in.
But my activity is preserving that rare species of whatever fish lives in that lake. That's my activity.
I get it, but I think that it quickly runs afoul of his concerns about engrossment. He really wants to say, and there's this really interesting conversation about the limits of homesteading and the inability to homestead with employees.
Yeah.
He really wants to say the limit to what I can claim is what I'm actually going to be using. And that's a morally very significant limitation.
Okay, so you think there's a bit of a circle squaring going on there?
I think that there's a non-neutrality that's going to emerge.
Okay.
Unfortunately, with the perverse consequence that it will incentivize people to engage in more intensive activities, because he does concede that agriculture basically does demand the full traditional set of freehold rights. And if it's the case that the only way that I really get the right to fence off my land and exclude trespassers and all the rest is that I start farming it, then that provides a kind of perverse incentive to do the more intensive things rather than the less intensive things. And so the kind of bad settler version of Lockeanism might sneak back in the back door.
Okay,
Yeah,
I see what you mean. I see what you mean now.
You could have a large group of people like, you know, the Jacob Levy Club who decide that they want to protect a waterland.
That's not a large group.
One could imagine. They wanted who wanted to protect a section of waterland, and we all put our shared sort of homesteading capability into claiming that land and agreeing mutually that we're not going to develop it and we're not going to fish the lake and we're not going to, you know, flatten the mountains. That might be one way to get around that. It's a really awkward way to get around it.
Yeah,
and there's a whole coordination problem thing there.
And the coordination problems exist for common pool resources, but he draws very well on the Bloomington School stuff to say,
Right.
to the degree that it's a common pool resource that we as a group are using,
Right.
yes, humans are really good at evolving their social mechanism. The question is whether non-use will ever...
Well, so, and this is interesting because I actually think it's sort of a cultural argument that we're having and have been having since industrialization really started to take off, right? If you possess land, you know, collectively or communally or individually, and the use that you are making of it is that you like to look out the window and see the family wooded acreage there, is that okay? Is that use? Is that using it? Or is that wasting
That's
it?
where I
Or
was
is that
going.
harming and aggressive? Yeah,
and if it is used, then that's going to swallow a lot of the rest of what he wants out of his theory.
right.
And if it isn't use, then there are some strange consequences too.
Right, then you head directly into dark satanic mills territory, right?
Don't you Dickens at me.
That was Blake.
Oh,
but you're right. I have a shelf of 19th century novels right off screen over there about this very debate, right? Ian, did you have anything that particularly left you either delighted or concerned by what you read? This seems like maybe a good place. Jacob has kind of given us some things to maybe worry about that weren't quite covered here, and maybe this is a good place to end if you have something you want.
Delighted and concerned that
Yeah.
it makes an argument that I find very amenable, but much more articulately than I would normally make it myself, which I think that's a cause for both delight and concern.
Well, I think that is high praise indeed. I want to thank both of you very much for a delightful and stimulating and extremely, for me, helpful conversation about the book. The book we've been discussing today is Property and Justice by Billy Christmas. I almost said Billy Crystal, Billy Christmas. And it deserves a better cover than it got. It is a deep and interesting work. And thank you both, Jacob Levy and Aeon Skoble, for the great conversation today.
Thanks for having me.
I had thought that this would finally be the occasion for Ian and I to yell at each other about Locke for a while, and it turned out not to be that occasion. We'll have to find a different occasion.
We'll have to have another occasion for doing that one.
Maybe we'll just all read Locke together next time.
Sure.
On that note, thank you very much. Bye,
Thank you.
everybody.
Bye.